welcome everyone to the first Writers Workshop for the AONTAS Adult Learners Journal. My name is Thomas Murray. I'm the Head of Research at AONTAS, recently started last month. And I'm absolutely delighted to facilitate this morning's session, find out what your queries might be around writing a piece of work and submitting it to the Adult Learner Journal, guiding you through some of the process. And then I'm delighted to welcome some members of the editorial board who will work with you in breakout discussions a little later on. Without further ado, I'm going to begin the presentation. And from just that initial conversation, I heard that quite a lot of people want to hear about the process, maybe an overview of how to submit, and advice then around the process for doing so, and how to write a good paper, good submission, which is great because they're all things we're going to cover in this morning's presentation. So I'm just going to share my screen now. And can everyone see that? Is that okay? Yeah, I'm seeing thumbs up. That's fantastic. So welcome along again to the first Writers Workshop for the Adult Learner Journal. And roughly, as you can see, from the agenda, that we will spend a little time this morning talking about developing articles for the Adult Learner Journal. We'll cover things like the style guide, the peer review process, and then the editorial board and the process, what happens once you've submitted your work, and what kind of supports are available to you as well, both from AONTAS and potentially from your peers as well. At 10:45, we'll break into discussion groups, and we'll break into two groups facilitated by our editorial board members. Group one will be for new or first-time writers, and Bernie Grummel and Nuala Glanton will facilitate that discussion. And for more experienced writers, we'll join group two with David Mallows and Rosemary Moreland. After the discussions at 11:20, we'll meet back for just a collective sharing and discussion around next steps, as well as any final questions that people might have about the process. So if at any time during the presentation, feel free to interrupt, feel free to ask questions, and feel free to type any questions you might have in the chat. Now, if I don't spot them, I'm sure Karis or Kate or Juliana will as well, and we'll bring them to our attention. Okay, so you're in a safe space for questions. There are no wrong questions here, and just really encourage you to contribute and participate as we go along. So my presentation will really cover the AONTAS Journal, what it is, what its ethos and requirements are. We will look at some examples from past submissions, based basically whether people are going to write a more theoretical paper or more of a case study, practice-based paper. And I heard in the conversation at the start, people possibly already leaning more towards one than the other, which is great. We'll then have the discussion groups, as I said. But just to begin with the overview of the Adult Learner Journal, it has been a review. There's a review in place from the 1970s, and in the 1980s, the Adult Learner Journal was founded. This is a really valuable resource, and it documents the growth and development of adult learning policy and practice. Importantly, it provides a forum for critical reflection on the practices of teaching and learning. And within that ethos, within that adult education ethos, it gives priority to subject matter that addresses disadvantage, social exclusion, equality, workplace learning, and the study of the teacher-student relationship. And I highly recommend an article by Golding in the 2019 edition of the Adult Learner Journal, where there's a survey of the previous, I think, 50 years of the adult learner and some of the main themes in it. It's a fantastic resource to give you a sense of the background. The availability of the journal is open access, and that means it's accessible all around the world. That's a huge strength. It enables AONTAS to assist educators and other workers in lifelong learning to develop their knowledge, skills, and competences, not only in Ireland, but across the world, and to become experts in the promotion of lifelong learning as a valued field of practice in the civic, social, and economic development of nations across the world. So your submissions will make your experience, your reflections, your analysis available to practitioners and to academics working on lifelong learning right around the world. And it's a really valuable conversation to have, beneficial for ourselves in our own work, but also beneficial for the field of adult education as a whole. And these benefits were picked up by Ted Fleming in the first edition of the Adult Learner Journal as far back as 1985, where he spoke about the importance of the journal as a space to cast a critical, analytical eye on all the developments that are taking place in adult education, as creating a space for reflection and debate. So I think Tony mentioned, all the changes in terms of adult literacy over the last 10, 15 years. I think John mentioned, the changes in relationships around FOSS and so on. All of these changes have taken place. The journal is a space to reflect on them, to write your analysis on concepts, on practice, on taken for granted assumptions, and hopefully we come to better understandings and better practice as a result. So that Golding and Harvey piece that I mentioned from 2019, again, it's in the Adult Learner Journal, freely available online for you to go back and check out. It reviews the past publications of the journal and shows its past themes and topics. And at all times, the emphasis in most articles has been on empowering learning through diverse communities and diverse learners. So they highlight some of the main topics or themes that have come up in community development, policy or politics around adult education, second chance education, literacy, literacy education, language, the role of women, feminism, feminist community education, and the role of reflection, reflective practice. So these are some of the main themes to emerge from the journal. But equally, as policy and practice has changed in Ireland, the journal has been used as a way of recording those changes and also to interrogate them, to reflect on them critically. So when it comes to thinking about equality, there's quite a focus on community, on disadvantage amongst educational access opportunities, low literacy, discrimination on the basis of gender, or exclusion on the basis of citizenship status, like migrants or refugees. But interestingly, when it comes to some themes that, such as Irish, disabilities, or adult learning and well-being, these themes, Golding and Harvey pointed out, haven't been as explicitly addressed in the journal to date. So in more recent years, the journal has adopted a practice of having themes. So in 2018, it was around taking the temperature of adult learning. 2019, celebrating 50 years of AONTAS as the voice of adult learning, looking at the impact of Paulo Freire, 2020, impact of COVID-19 in 21, 22 about measuring success, and last year, topics relating to the fields of adult and community education. So this year, the theme of the journal and the call for papers essentially is an invitation to potential authors to explore the power of adult learning to drive change. So some of the key questions that we're thinking about: what do we mean by change? What constitutes both individual and collective change in adult learning? What practical changes are being made by adult educators as a result of policy? So papers exploring these topics are particularly welcome. Practices that support transformative adult learning, the capacity of the adult learning sector to drive change, adult learning for social equality, and case studies exploring the impact of adult learning on learners. Okay, are there any questions on those themes or on that call for papers? I just realized I can't see people's hands actually, the things in Zoom. So if anyone has a question on it, they might indicate in the chat. So Linda was just asking whether you get access to the slide deck, and I believe so. I think that should be fine. Yeah, Karis is nodding. Yeah, that's a yes. So don't feel that you have to, write everything down. These will be available to you afterwards. Okay. So in terms of advice, then moving on to advice, once you've made the decision to submit a piece, I think we can look at, well, essentially it's what's your message? What do you want to say in this piece? Maybe you've implemented something that has worked well in your role, in your job, in your practice. Maybe you've observed a change in adult education that you want to discuss further. You want to raise awareness about something. You've reflected on an issue and you have some critical observations to make, or you want to analyze something in more depth. Possibly you've done something differently that challenges the usual way of thinking, or you want to comment on policy direction using your own experience or practice as a lens. These are all angles on the submissions that we've seen in the Adult Learner Journal over the years. There are essentially two types of article that the journal accepts. One is a theory or critical debate paper. And this is the first type. Generally, we ask for about 8,000 words as a word limit. And these are papers that engage in critical debate and analysis of concepts, policies, and theories or practices in the field. They might include findings from recent research, and where this is the case, there should include a brief outline of any research methodologies used. So these theory or critical debate papers might initiate a dialogue between individuals, groups, or sectors in the field of lifelong learning. Okay, so that's type 1, the theory or critical debate paper. Type 2 is a more practice-based paper, a shorter paper of 3,000 words. And these practice-based papers include case studies which exchange ideas about what works in various programs and contexts, maybe what's innovative about them, what's an example of good practice. And so these kinds of practice-based papers will outline the case study and engage in analysis of the practical aspects about the particular intervention or program that's been made or created. So essentially, as you sit down to write, maybe you have started that process already, or you're in the beginning of planning it. It's a good idea to try and align it with the journal's focus. So you get a sense of that by looking at previous issues of the journal as well as the particular call for papers and themes that we're looking for in this year's journal, the 2024 Adult Learner. So think about the audience you're going to write for, outline possibly some of your perspective or where you're coming from on the particular issue. And we'd encourage writers to really structure their article, whether it's a theory piece or a practice-based paper, and we'll delve into that in just a bit. But essentially that your paper should have a very clear argument, a very clear introduction outlining the topic you're going to engage in, what your argument is, and then a kind of coherent structure, very clear paragraphs and so on, so that it's easy to follow the thread of your argument as you develop it through the theoretical piece or through the case study. Most articles will include a discussion, possibly as to the limits of your research. If it's a case study, it's recognizing, the limitations of looking at one intervention or one program, to say, yes, possibly there's some good things happening here, but we can't generalize beyond this case, maybe without engaging in further research. To talk about the significance or discuss the significance of your work, why it matters, to keep that in mind, as to why should people read this work, what will they find out, what's new and significant and meaningful about it. In general, we'd encourage authors to write in a very consistent style. It is a form of academic writing, and that means there's certain conventions around tone and terminology and so on that I think you best appreciate by reading some of the earlier articles in the Adult Learner Journal. But equally, if you're new to writing, we'd still encourage you to get stuck in, and there's not to be intimidated by that, that there are conventions for academic writing, but these are things to be learned, and absolutely to give it a go, and we can give feedback through the editorial board process of review, as well as through the peer learning network. As with all journals, there is a style guide, which is available on the AONTAS website and will be circulated to everyone here. We'd ask and encourage you to follow the style guide. There are conventions around how you reference sources, how you use punctuation and so on. And these are a set of conventions for consistency across the journal. We'd encourage you to adhere to those. And lastly, the last kind of piece of advice here is around providing evidence, that the claims you make, the arguments you make should be supported. And that evidence can come from your experience in a case study. It can come from the data that you gather through your own original research, your own interviews or focus groups, as well as evidence from the wider literature, if you're engaging in more desk-based research. So Karis has very kindly posted the link to the style guide in the comments, just in case you're wondering where they were located. Are there any questions on anything I've gone through there? I hope it's reasonably clear. Okay. If there are questions, feel free to type them in the chat. We'll just look very briefly then at some examples from past submissions that were included in the Adult Learner Journal. So as you can see here, here's the table of contents essentially for the Adult Learner Journal of 2022. I've brought a prop, have it here to hand. And you can see a whole range of pieces that, the theme for that year was around measuring success within adult education. And you can see the real diversity of pieces covering things, topics around anti-racism, ESOL courses, human rights and social inclusion, creating communities of practice, psychological capital, and education. Huge diversity there. They all speak to that common theme of how we go about measuring success. So the more theory or research-based submissions, you might recall these are the papers that are quite significantly longer. They're about 8,000 words. And a good example of one of these is from Aisling Brennan and Maeve O'Grady, their piece, Psychological Capital, The Missing Link. And this is a very accessible article on the potential of what they describe as psychological capital, thinking about it as a concept, how it can be used to think about how we can widen outcomes and measures in PhET, as a way of talking about success for adult learners differently and in broader terms than PLSS. So I suppose the piece to take away from this example is how they approach this longer form of article. So there's a very clear introduction. It explains what the article aims to do and where the evidence comes from and where are the gaps in practice. So in this case, the authors felt that there was a gap in terms of measuring success in terms of current practice to how things are measured, and felt that psychological capital would address that gap. The authors then go on to look at the context. Why is this research significant? Who is it speaking to? And the article is present within a context, drawing on literature from policy, from EU, NGOs, and other journal articles, essentially to show how this concept of psychological capital speaks to a need within the field and speaks to different debates within adult education. And this is forwarded in the literature review. At that point, having set up the article, the authors then present the findings from the literature and the doctoral research. And they use figures, they use tables or illustrations to complement the written piece in the article. And finally, as with many theory and theoretical papers, they'll include recommendations for practitioners, providers, and funders, policymakers. And again, there's a conclusion here where they summarize what they've written, and they also talk about the limitations. The article can't address everything. There's possibly areas they may wish to have spoken about in more depth, or further research they may need to conduct. And they've clearly specified what those are and their own viewpoint as to where research needs to go next. Okay, so in some cases, I suppose the things to note is that the piece doesn't use a lot of subheadings. It's very clear that a piece they use paragraph breaks instead, so it's very clear signposting in the article itself rather than a lot of subheadings. There's very simple language used, and sometimes they talk about, we believe or we think when they're talking about their findings in areas where it's unclear. And also there's a thread all the way through from start to finish. So an introduction, an argument, and a conclusion. Essentially, that's easy to follow all the way through. So that's the theoretical paper. The other type of paper is the case study, which is much more practice-based and generally will look at a specific example of practice. So the example here is a piece that I wrote for the 22 Learner Journal about AONTAS' Right to Work education project. So it's talking about well, what does success look like when it comes to human rights education? And looking at it, one particular project, the Right to Work Education Project, which is essentially about partnering with international protection applicants living in direct provision and developing a course with them that would look at the right to work, both from a human rights perspective, in terms of what people's rights and entitlements are, but also in terms of what kinds of supports people might need to access the labour market, or to get more involved in their community, or to stand up for their rights in situations where they're being infringed. So with the case study, I suppose the thing to take in mind for people who are maybe looking at writing a case study themselves, again, there's an introduction, brief overview of what the project is, and maybe some of the research literature around similar projects, around what the purpose, the structure, the time frame of the project is, and some survey data kind of outlining, essentially the nuts and bolts of the case study. Second section looks at program delivery, describing how the program was run, what the challenges were for the providers and for the participants. And I think I recall some of the feedback from the editors when I first submitted the piece was to think about not just what worked well, but what didn't work well, what were the challenges, and that was a really useful feedback to take on board then. So it's something I'd advise or pass on to yourselves as well. When thinking about evaluating programs, what's working well, what hasn't. The final or third section there was looking at how we might evidence impact, and then in conclusion, having looked at the nuts and bolts of the program and how to evaluate it, the final section steps back from the case study to look at the bigger picture. So this is about reflection and meaning making as to what's significant about it. And here we get to reference other theorists and the wider literature. So these examples, then I think they all roughly have a similar structure. These are all things that are asked for in submissions: a title, an abstract, keywords that your piece will address, and so on. So I'm going to just skip forward, just in the interest of time. But when we're looking at credibility, I suppose the trustworthiness of a piece, when it comes to qualitative research, there can be a lot of essentially meaning making, where things are open to interpretation. And I think it's important as writers and authors of these pieces that you're thinking through how you provide evidence for your claims, and the process that you've gone through in order to make those claims. So what steps have you taken in order to analyze your case study, for example, and how is it credible? How can we believe what you're saying? So in that sense, it's about providing evidence. So I am a little conscious of time, because I do think it's important that we go into breakout groups for you to discuss these in a little more depth. But all of these slides will be available to you to go through. And just the final area, I suppose, is that's important to bear in mind, is the style guide, which Karis has popped into the chat. But the link is also contained here. And essentially, this is the Harvard referencing style for referencing other pieces of literature, and there's a standard process for that. So that's all typical for journals. So in terms of the timeline, the deadline for submission is the 16th of February. You're being invited to submit your written piece and an abstract. And you'll see over the subsequent weeks and months the process for reviewing through anonymous peer review, receiving feedback, and potentially progressing successful and accepted pieces to publication. Okay, so I think at this point we can, just before I hand on, just to make a note of the criteria for accepting pieces. These are all available, through the AONTAS website as well, and I just encourage you to become familiar with them. And they're essentially around, how relevant a topic is for adult community education. Has the article developed a theoretical framework? Has it a rigorous methodology in terms of providing evidence for the claims that you're making? Are the findings of the piece insightful? Are they relevant? Has the article followed the style guide and met the word limit? And is it well structured and well written overall? So these are the things that the editorial board will be looking at when they're assessing those submissions. So I think this is a nice time to break out into discussion rooms and talk through some of what you've heard, and maybe some of your own concerns about your own pieces and own queries about the process. So Karis, will I hand back to yourself just in terms of setting up the breakout rooms?
Thanks so much, Thomas. That was fantastic. I hope everyone has a good overview now of the process. And what we'll do in the next section is we'll have 2 discussion groups where you can join members of the editorial board and then members of the editorial office, which is the AONTAS office. So that's myself and Kate will also be in those groups. And what you can do here is discuss in more depth your ideas, talk with each other about how you might trace this out and really get a start on thinking about what kind of article you might like to submit. So we're going to have 2 breakout groups. One will be led by Rosemary and David, and that will be for experienced academic writers. So that is if you submitted something to a journal before, if you're familiar with this process, that would be the group for you to join. If you're a newer writer, or if it's the first time that you've submitted to a journal like this, then Bernie and Nuala from the editorial board will facilitate that group, and there'll be a chance there to explore those ideas. So my colleague Juliana is going to set up the 2 groups and just take a moment to decide which group is more suitable for you, whether you'd like to join the new writers group or the more experienced writers group.
Welcome back, everyone. Nearly there. Just some brief updates, I suppose, around next steps. Just to share my screen here. Okay. So at this point, you might be wondering, how do you submit an article? And it's very straightforward. Just email your piece to journal@aontas.com. Include the proposed article title, the proposed article type, and you might recall type 1 being the more theoretical, longer form piece of 8,000 words, or type 2, the more case study based approach, which had a 3,000 word count, and a short profile of yourself. So 200 words. And if in doubt about what those should look like, you might look back at previous editions of the Adult Learner Journal, where you'll find plenty of examples of short profiles. You should also include an article abstract. The abstract itself should be between 400 and 500 words. And as with all abstracts, they provide an introductory overview of your piece, the method that you'll use where this is applicable, and how your article relates to adult and community education. In other words, you're, in a sense, motivating the question, showing why your research is important and why your contribution is important, how it's significant and meaningful for adult and community education. A reminder as well that the deadline for submissions is 5 p.m. on Friday, the 16th of February. So some time, but not a lot of time at the same time. And I'd really be very conscious, possibly, that people who are new to writing articles, you know, the initial conversation or presentation this morning contained a lot of maybe unfamiliar words and terminology, but I just really encourage you to give it a go. You know, that you will get support with writing your piece and submitting it, and not to be put off if it's a little bit strange or unfamiliar. We really want to hear from everyone. So the review process itself, once the journal team receives submissions by email, they'll be reviewed by the editorial board, and 2 reviewers will review the papers. Your papers will be anonymous. We won't know who's attached to what paper. And those reviews will be completed in February or of 24, and the authors will be advised as to whether their submission has been accepted or not in March. Okay, so approximately 1 month or a little bit more between submitting the final deadline for submission and being advised as to whether your piece has been accepted or not. There is the longer timeline detailed in the slides a little earlier, but suffice to say that the journal itself will launch in the winter of 2024, and indeed the journal for 2023 is due to be launched in the coming weeks, and will be available through the AONTAS website, as always. So in terms of additional supports, feel free to call AONTAS on 01406 8220, or email journal@aontas.com, and you'll find support there in terms of your drafting your submission and its submission to the journal. There will be a second workshop on finalizing articles in early 2024, and the team at AONTAS will be in touch about that once we've settled on a date. The editorial office can provide feedback on the technical aspects of the journal articles, along with the editorial's feedback on the content. And finally, there's the Peer Learning Network, which is an opportunity for potential writers and authors amongst yourselves today to link in with one another and to discuss common issues and provide maybe peer-to-peer support and mutual learning. So if you wish to be involved in that, I think Juliana has already gathered some volunteers or names of people who are interested in the Peer Learning Network. But feel free to get in touch at journal@aontas.com if that's something you want to get involved in more. And one of the examples might even be to set up a WhatsApp group amongst potential contributors for advice and mutual support. So with all of those, feel free to contact journal@aontas.com if you haven't already indicated that you want to be involved in it. Okay, so that's essentially it. Really, if you've any further questions from this point on, journal@aontas.com is the place to go. Okay, if there aren't any more questions, then just want to thank everyone for attending today. It's been lovely to meet some of you online and to chat about your research. thanks a million to our editorial board, to Rosemary, Bernie, and Nuala for offering up your time. I think David as well a little earlier on, and for supporting the journal. I think it's fantastic. So I think that's it, other than to say goodbye and best of luck with your writing. We look forward to seeing it in the coming weeks and months.